Okay, so welcome to Introduction to Working with Data in Excel. So no matter what you're doing with anything in Excel, we're considering it data. So it's not really necessarily meaning doing a lot of like quantitative or statistical work. It could mean that, but it could just mean working with everyday information that makes sense to put in a table format, right? So a spreadsheet application like Excel or Google Sheets is using tabular data. So it formats it in a table. The data set we're working with was compiled by Walt Hickey at the blog 538, which is now owned by ESPN, so it's not so much a blog anymore, I suppose. But that's Nate Silver's, I guess he created that platform originally, and they do a lot of work with like sports statistics and political polling and things like that. And they publish a lot of their data sets openly. So this is one of the data sets that they collected. This was back in, I think, 2012. So it's a list of movies that is scraped from IMDb, the Internet Movie Database. So they have things like the IMDb code in column B. So that's a unique identifier for each film. They have the title of the movie. They have the year that it came out in column A. And then they have some information about how much money the films gross domestically and internationally, their budget, and their budget category, and some other information as well. It also has some information about whether it failed or passed the Bechdel test. And so that means that this was a criteria created by cartoonist Alison Bechdel, who developed this idea of criteria for determining whether a film is quote unquote female friendly. So the idea being that it has to pass all three criterion. And the first one is that there has to be a named female character in the film. So, or two, there have to be two named female characters in the film. So it can't be like waitress one or something like that. The second criteria is that they have those two named female characters who have, so characters who have names, have to have a conversation with each other in the film. And the third criteria is that that conversation can't be about a man. So those are pretty low bars for like being a female friendly film. But you can already see in column D that a lot of films fail that test, that very low standard for having any kind of female friendliness or whatever we want to call it. So there's some different data types in this spreadsheet. There's text data. So we have movie title, and that's sort of written out, what we call text, or another word for that is string. So string or text data means it's like, you know, your typed out letters. Doesn't have any, it could have numbers, but as long as it has a letter, it's going to be considered text by Excel. So you'll see at column B, IMDb code, it has both letters and numbers, but it is actually considered text by Excel. And I know this because it is left justified. So in the cell itself, in the column, you can see that movie title and IMDb code are to the left of the cell. And if you look at, let's say, column E or column F, you'll see these are numbers and they're right justified. They're on the right-hand side of the column. That indicates that they're stored as numerical values, as numbers. So that's a quick way to see what Excel thinks your data are, because sometimes you will have numbers and they will be stored as text, and then it won't let you do calculations on it and things like that. And this is a really simple way to just see that offhand. And I'll show you a bit later how to convert numbers to text if they are truly numbers. So we have text, we have numerical values, so that ranges on a scale from, it could be negative to positive, or it could be 0 to some kind of positive number. And we have a binary data type, which is 0 and 1. 0 meaning false or negative, and 1 meaning true or positive. And that is a really useful shorthand when you're working with calculations in Excel, because it recognizes zeros and ones according to that kind of logic scheme, right? That 0 is fail and 1 is pass or true. So at this point, we are going to do some basic calculations. Are there any questions so far? You can put them in the chat if there are. I'll keep going. So one thing I would also like to mention is that the way that we identify a cell, a single cell in Excel, is by the letter of the column and the number of the row. So rows are observations. So each entry is sort of a unique film in this case. If you were working with a grade book or like a list of students, then each student would be one observation. They would take up one row. So everything in that row is information about one person or one film in this case, let's say. Columns are what we call variables, where we store our variables. So that's things that vary across our observations. So things that change or vary across students or across the films in this case. In this case, title is something that differs across each film, and that's why it makes sense to have a column. Student names would differ normally, right? Or would be important information about an individual. So we identify each cell by the letter of the column and then the number of the rows. So I'm clicked on funny haha, which is in cell C5. And that's how I could indicate to someone the information that I'm looking at right now. So we're going to go ahead and get started with, hold on, I'm just going to check something. Okay. We're going to go ahead and get started with calculating some information. So we're going to type into cell K1. We're going to put a new header in our sheet. So the first row is normally given to headers or the labels of each column so that you know what's in the column. And you want to give it a sort of descriptive name, but something that's not too long. So a sort of shorthand code, but something that's understandable to anyone else who might look at the spreadsheet. So what we're going to do is calculate the, let's see, total profit, which total revenue, I think, is a combination. Yes, it's a combination of domestic gross and international gross. And what we're going to do is calculate the revenue minus the budget, right? So the profit of a film is how much it made after taking into account how much it cost to make the film. So the profit would be the revenue subtracting the budget. So in order to do that, we're going to do a calculation, and all calculations in Excel start with an equal sign. So I'm going to go ahead and type an equal sign in K2. Oh, and before I move on, I just want to mention that if anyone noticed that when I type total profit and hit enter, the cell K1 maintained the formatting of the header, right? It's like got a navy blue background and white type. So what Excel does in more recent versions is it tries to guess what you want to do based on things that you have already done. And sometimes it's right and sometimes it's wrong. And sometimes it's very hard to undo the guessing or to figure out why it's doing something. But it's making this sort of like informed guess. And sometimes that's useful and sometimes not. So in this case, it's kind of useful because I don't need to do any extra steps to reformat that cell myself. But let's say I didn't want it to be formatted the same way. Well, then I would have to go back and undo the formatting, right? So that can be nice, but it's also, you know, it's also something that doesn't give you a lot of manual control over everything. So just something to be aware of, that sometimes Excel just does things. So I'm in K2 and you'll see that I've typed an equal sign. You should also be able to see in the formula bar, that's this big open text area that's above the columns in the table. So that's called the formula bar, and you can normally see the full formula there that you're typing out. So if we wanted to subtract the budget from the total revenue, we would first need to take that number 1221608, and then we would put a subtraction or minus sign, and then we would put the budget for that first observation, for that first film, which is 8632. So that was a really cheap film, apparently. And we will hit enter, and then it will calculate a number. But this is not a very efficient way to do calculations. There's almost 2,000 rows in this spreadsheet. So if I had to do that by hand for each row, for each film, would take me quite some time, and it's possible that I would make errors typing the numbers. So what I want to do instead is use references to cells in order to create this calculation. So I'm going to click back on K2, and in the formula bar, I'm just going to highlight and delete the calculation that I just did. And I'm going to go ahead and type an equal sign again. And this time, instead of typing the actual numbers that are in the cells located in row 2, I'm going to type the references to the cells. So that would be, or I'm going to click. So you can click on cell J2. We want to subtract from the total revenue of the first film. So that's cell J2. So you can either click on it and it'll put it into your formula or your calculation, or you can type J2, and it's not case sensitive. So you can type uppercase, lowercase, and it'll still get which cell you're referring to. So I have J2, and then I want to put a minus sign for subtraction, and then I want to subtract the budget from that revenue. So I can either, again, click on F2 where the budget is located for that film, or I can type F2. So I should have equals J2 minus F2, and I go ahead and hit enter, and then I get that same number I got before, but this time when I click on it, I'll see the number in cell K2, but in the formula bar, I see the formula. So it's stored as a return of a formula right now. The nice thing is that I can carry this formula down and repeat it all the way down column K instead of having to type it out many, many times. And the way that I do that is by relative referencing. So if I copy a formula down a column, each row, the formula in each row will be relative to the row that it's in. So that's called relative referencing in Excel, and it's the default way of copying formulas. So if I go ahead and hover my cursor over the bottom right-hand corner of that cell, K2, you should see that the cursor turns into a black cross with no arrows. In a Mac, this might not work in older versions of Excel for the Mac version of Excel. So if this doesn't work, you're gonna have to do it, drag and drop it manually, and I'll show you how to do that as well. But we're going to try the shortcut version for the folks who might have more recent versions of Excel. It should work. So if you have your cursor over that little green square in the bottom right corner of that cell, you can just go ahead and double click, and it should copy the formula down the entire column K. So that's a shortcut for copying formulas. Back in the olden days of early versions of Excel, you would just hover over that same green square. You would have the cursor with a black cross with no arrows, and you would click, hold down, and drag it down all the way to the end of the spreadsheet, and that is annoying and takes time. It will work equally as well, but there's shortcuts now that make those kinds of things easier. So again, you would just hover over that green square, double click, and it should copy down. And then if I click in K3 and I look in the formula bar, I will see that it says equals J3 minus F3. So it's updating relative to the row it's in as it's going down. So again, that's the default in Excel. It's called relative referencing, that the cell numbers referenced are relative to the row that they're in, right? So it doesn't just copy J2 minus F2 down the whole column. Okay. Any questions? I'm going to wait and see if there's anything in the chat. Okay, going to move on. Just checking my guide to make sure I stay on track. Okay, so we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to click on cell L1. And we're going to type the number 1 million. And I recommend you use commas as thousands separators, just to not lose track of what the number is. So I'm typing 1, 000, 000. You don't need the commas. Excel will understand that it's a number and that those are separating thousands either way, but you can use commas in Excel to separate thousands. So I'm typing 1 million into L1. And basically the point of this, and then I hit enter, the point of this is that I'm interested in, let's say, understanding the international gross in millions of dollars. So the numbers that are here right now for like profit and revenue and international gross, they are a little bit hard to digest, right? There, you know, if I just look at them without thousand separators or without standardizing them in some way, according to the way that we report profit for films, it's really hard to just look at something and say 697,797. What does that mean? So if we convert it to millions of dollars, then it will be easier to understand. So you'll see after I hit enter after typing 1 million into cell L1, that it did not update the formatting for row 1, the header formatting. So it's not a rule that it always keeps the header formatting the same. It's a rule that it keeps it the same for text only, right? So it doesn't think the number is a header, so it's leaving it with no formatting. Let's try to type something in cell M1. Let's type international growth in millions of US dollars. And hit enter. Oh, and it updated the formatting again. Excel, so wonderful, so annoying. So if I didn't know that that's what it was doing, I might be really confused about why it skipped L1, right? The number 1 million. You can sort of reverse engineer what it's thinking by like figuring out what the pattern it thinks you want is. At the same time, I think in this case, it's obvious to me, but in some cases, it is not that obvious what it's thinking. So just something to be aware of is that it just does that. So in cell M2, we're going to type an equal sign, and we're going to divide the international gross column H, by the $1 million, and that will give us the international gross in millions of dollars. So I've typed the 1 million there so I would have a cell to reference, so I won't have to type it out, and if I wanted to change the units to billions, I could just do that and it would update the whole column. So there's some reasons to do this. This is mostly just to show an example. I would not recommend putting just a number into the row of your headers normally. But so I'm going to go ahead and click on H2 or type H2. And then I'm going to put the divide by sign, which is the backslash. And then I'm going to click on L1. So it's going to be H2 divided by 1 million. And I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. So now I'll see, okay, it made less than $1 million, right? Like that's clearer to me. It made 0.7 of $1 million. If I wanted to update L1 to 1 billion, so let's say if I added another 3 zeros, it would update the number in M2. You don't have to do that, but just showing you that that can be a reason why having a reference might be useful, because then you don't have to retype it. Again, it might not come up that often. So I'm going to do 1 million again. So now let's say I want to copy this down the whole column. So I'm going to go ahead and double click in the bottom right corner, and I get an error, right? So I think the first thing is when you get an error in Excel, I feel like it throws shouty caps at you. It's got a hashtag, it's got an exclamation point, which seems really dramatic. They look really, you know, like very, very like you did something super wrong. But I think it's really just basically it's just trying to tell you like what you did and, you know, how to fix it essentially. So we just never need to panic when we get errors. If at any time you see a cell with a little green triangle in the top left corner, it means there's a drop down menu that you can click or a note. So over here, I see like this big caution sign. So I can click on this. And then it tells me what error it is. So it's a divide by 0 error. It's saying I'm trying to divide something by 0, which is mathematically not possible. So I can't do that, which makes sense. So then if I go ahead and click on M3 and I look in the formula bar, I see what's going on. It's doing that relative referencing as I've copied the formula down the column. So now it's doing H3 divided by L2. And then, oops. Let's hit enter. And then if I go to M4, it's H4 divided by L3, right? And then so on and so forth. So it's updating column H, the row number, H2, H3, H4. That's what I want. I want it to divide each of those numbers as the formula is copied down, but I don't want it to update the row number for column L. I always want it to refer to L1, that row number 1. That's where the million is, and that's always what I want it to refer to. I don't want it to refer to L2 or L3 or L4 as it gets copied down, because there's nothing in those cells. They're blank, and Excel treats blank cells as zeros in calculations. So that's something to be aware of as well. So if I want to go ahead and fix this, what I can do is click on cell M2, so where my original function is. And I can go into the formula bar up at the top, and I'm going to go ahead and click in between the L and the 1 for that cell reference. So my cursor is flashing in between L and 1. And I'm going to go ahead and put a $sign. Oops, that's an ampersand, a $sign in between the L and the 1. So the $sign in this case is in between L and 1, but it is actually before the row number 1. And what the $sign does is it locks the reference to that row number or that column letter. If it was before the column letter, so if I put a $sign before the L, it would lock to column L. But we only needed to lock to the first row of L, so L1, because we're not going to copy this function across columns. So it's not going to change from L to N to N to O. It's always going to be column L, but we do need it to always lock to cell 1 of column L. So the $sign does something called absolute referencing. So relative referencing is the default. It's relative to the row that it's in, the cell references. Absolute referencing means that it locks to a cell and always refers to that cell as it's copied down. So if I go ahead and hit enter, and then click on M2 and double click in the bottom corner to copy that down, now that should be fixed. And so if I click on M3, I'll see it's H3 divided by L $1 and H4 divided by L $1 and so on and so forth. So it's doing absolute referencing. It's not updating that number as it's copied down, but it is updating the row number for column H, which is what I want. Any questions about absolute referencing? This will come up again. Excel builds pivot tables and visualizations using absolute references. So something to just be aware of, and when you see it again, you'll know what it means. But any questions at this point? You can go ahead and put them in the chat and Sandy can read them out. If anyone wants me to repeat that. Everyone's eating their lunch at the same time. That's okay. Okay, so we'll move on in a second to some built-in functions. So we've been doing some calculations ourselves. We did subtraction, we did addition, or we did division. So you can see that you can do basic calculations with math operators like multiplication, division, subtraction, addition, without the need of using a built-in formula in Excel. But there are a lot of mathematical operations that you would not want to type out yourself. You could do it, but it would just take forever. So in column N1, we're going to type average profit and hit enter. So just a note here, you would not put averages, which gives you one value, right? So there's only going to be one average for the entire column of profit. There's not going to be an average for each row. You wouldn't want to do that in the same table or the same sheet as your data set. You would want to do this in another sheet where you have some summary statistics about your data set. Because then it you lose track of what's the actual data and what are the things you've done to do calculations on the data. But I'm doing it here just to make it easy to not have to switch back and forth between sheets. So average profit. So we could go ahead and type the equal sign again in cell N2. And if we wanted to calculate it by hand, we could. We would have to add up each cell in column K, so that's the profit. So we'd have to add K2 plus K3 plus K4 plus K5, all the way to the last row, which is 1776 or something like that. There's 1700 or something. So we could add them all together and then divide that by the total number of cells, which is 1777 or 78 or something like that. And we'd have to know that. So we'd have to go figure out how many cells there are or how many rows there are. So we could do all that by hand, but that would take forever and be really inefficient. So in this case, we can use a built-in function. And if we want to use a built-in function for something, normally they're called the thing that is used colloquially to describe it. So an average can be called an average or a mean. So you might take the mean of some data or the average. Those are sort of the two words that both are used colloquially to describe an average. So if you're not sure, you can, I'm going to delete that equal sign. I'm going to go to the formula menu up at the top. So there's home, insert, page layout, formulas. So if I click on formulas and I click on insert function, you'll get a pop-up window where it tells you to type a brief description of what you want to do and click go. So I'll say I want the average, and then I'll click go. And then it'll give you a list of things that it thinks make sense. So the first one is average. It says it returns the arithmetic mean. That's exactly what I want of its arguments. So I'm like, cool. So there's a bunch of other kinds of ones that have average in it, but I just want a basic, mean of the data. So that's what it is. So if you type around like for something, it tries to match what you're typing with the function that's relevant. It's not always right. But normally if you type something in, it will tell you like what's the actual function so that you could figure that out. So I know then you'll get the hang of it and you'll be familiar with some functions. And in this case, I know that average is average. So I'll go ahead and type an equal sign in N2, and then I'll start typing the word average. As I type it, you'll see a little pop-up menu that lists some of those average functions. If I see the one I want, so the first one, average, in that menu is the one I want. So I'm just gonna, what you can do is just double click on that. I'm gonna just double click and it's gonna pull it into the cell. And if I look at the formula, and then if you look underneath, it'll have this pop-up that'll show you number 1, comma, number 2 in brackets. It basically tells you, that little pop-up, like which part of the function you're working on. So number 1 is in bold. It says you have to put some kind of number for me to calculate an average for you. And then after that, you can put in more numbers. And that's all that this function can take. So it tells you what it needs, like it needs a number and then another number and then another. So that you know how to do that. So you could also type average. You don't have to double click and pull it in like that. You can just type the word average. It's not case sensitive. So I've typed it in with lowercase and it's totally fine as well. You need an open parentheses to start your function. And then I'm gonna go ahead and click on K2. That's the first observation for profit. So I'm gonna pull the entire column of data of column K, not including the header, into this function, and then it will calculate an average on those numbers. So first I'll click K2, and then you want to sort of select down to the bottom of this column, and there's a shortcut for that. So you're gonna hold down Control and Shift at the same time. I'm holding them both down. And on a Mac, it would be Command and Shift at the same time. This doesn't always work on a Mac, so I apologize to the people who have older versions of Excel and Mac. Control Shift, and then you want to hit the down arrow at the same time. I'm not doing it yet. So you want to hold them both, all 3 down at the same time. So usually you Control Shift and then the down, and then you want to lift your finger. You just want to do it once to get it to the bottom of the thing. If you keep holding it, it's going to go down to the millionth row of your spreadsheet or something like that. So Control Shift down arrow, and now it's at the bottom of the spreadsheet on row 1777. So it's selected them all, and you should see in the formula bar that it says K2 colon K1777. So if you want to select through to the end of a column or the end of some kind of selection, you use a colon. So the colon means through. So K2 through K1777 is what is meant by the colon there. And so the shortcut for selecting that all is Control Shift or Command Shift, and then the down arrow just one time, hitting them all together. And then if I scroll up, I'll see in cell N2, I have the same formula. I can go ahead and close that with a closed parentheses. So that should all be within the parentheses. And it's basically saying, I'm taking the average function and I'm running it on the things that are in these parentheses. So that's how functions work. I'm going to go ahead and enter, and then I get the average. And I'll wait a second if there's any questions that people want to put in the chat. Okay, I'm going to just show you one other way to calculate average that uses 2 functions. It's less efficient, but it's to demonstrate that you can use many functions in the same formula or calculation. So in cell N3, we're going to go ahead and type the equal sign. And we are going to, basically, if you break down what is an average, it's taking the sum or the total of a set of numbers and dividing it by the number of items that you have, right? So it's the sum of those items divided by the count of those items. And that's sort of the functions that we would use. So sum is a function that adds up a series of numbers, and count is a function that just counts the number of items within a series of cells. So we're going to type in equal sign and then type sum. And then we can double click on sum if we want to. And we're going to, again, click on K2, do Control Shift down arrow. And then in our formula bar up at the top, we're going to close that parentheses. So we should have equal sum, open parentheses, K2 colon K1777. And I'm going to scroll all the way up to the top, and I'm going to put a divide by sign. So we're going to divide the sum. So it's going to calculate that sum, and then it's going to divide it by the count, the total number that's in that column. So we'll go ahead and type count. So these are really useful formulas to know if you just want to do some quick math. And I'm going to double click on count or type out count. And then again, I want the same series. I want K2 through K1777. So I already see it here. Instead of selecting, I'm just going to type it K2 through K1777. I mean, it's better to select just because then you can be sure it's correct, but and there's no typos, but I'm too lazy to even select. So I'm just typing it out. And you can see that the lowercase, uppercase doesn't even matter. And I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, and then I get the same number, right? So this is just to show that there's multiple ways to do the same thing in Excel. And there's no right way or wrong way. There's sometimes more efficient ways, but that's, you know, it's saving you a few seconds in the end. And that you can use many functions in the same calculation. Any questions about that? I'm going to give you a minute, and then we'll move on. So I'm going to switch and just do a little note about how you would sort your data if you wanted to do that. So I have a bunch of movies and I have year, but let's say I wanted them in order of year first. Like I wanted them from earliest films to latest films. That's the order that I want them in. So what I can do is select all the data first. So I'll go ahead and click cell A1. That's where my table starts. And I can do Control Shift down. So that gets me to the bottom, and I let go as soon as I hit the down arrow. So just like you want to tap it once. And then I'm going to do Control Shift or Command Shift and the right hand arrow, the right arrow on your keyboard. Again, like one tap. And that selected everything. So that is a way, those are shortcuts. You can do Control Shift down, Control Shift right, Control Shift left, Control Shift up, and that will help you select like a large data set quite quickly and just the table that you want. And then I'm going to go back to that home menu up at the top. My screen is not expanded enough. Where are my menus? So you should see an editing section of the home menu up at the top. So there's sort and filter is one of the options. It's actually a drop-down selection. So when I hover my cursor over sort and filter, it's a button that you can click. It's a drop-down menu, and then it'll give you a dialog box where you can choose the kind of sort you want. And I'm going to go ahead and click Custom Sort. Custom Sort. And now it's showing me what it's actually sorted on right now, which is it's sorted on the budget, smallest to largest. You want to make sure this box here, my data has headers, is checked off so that it does not sort the first row. So then you'll still have the header at the top of your sheet. You want to make sure to tell it like don't sort the top row. And instead of budget, I'm going to go ahead and put year. So I'm going to sort it by year, and then I'm going to add a level and say within each year, like let's say there's multiple films per year. So within each year, I want to sort movie title alphabetically. And you'll see here, so first it's going to sort by year from smallest to largest, and then movie title from A to Z. And you'll see that we can tell right away that year is stored as a number because it's recognizing that it can be sorted from smallest to largest. And movie title is stored as text because it says it has to be alphabetical A to Z. So that's another way to see what data type Excel thinks you're working with for each column. So we will go ahead and click OK. La, la, la. Then you will get a warning. And this is also something that happens a lot in Excel where it's like worth reading it. So it says, some numbers are formatted as text in the movie title column. So for example, we have the film 1984, right? So that's a number, but it's a title of a film, right? And it's stored as text. It's a number that's stored as text, or like Terminator 2. The 2 is stored as text because it's part of the title. So it's asking you, do you want to sort it things that look like a number as a number? Or do you want to sort numbers and numbers stored as text separately? So we're going to sort numbers and numbers stored as text separately. You could do one or the other and then see what are the implications. It normally doesn't matter unless there's some real reason that they need to be sorted chronologically for the numbers. So numbers stored as text will be sorted alphabetically, which is instead of like 1, 2, 3, it would be 1, 11, 111. So all the ones will be first no matter what, whether or not that makes sense for numbers chronologically. So that's how when you store text, numbers stored as text, when you order them alphabetically, all the ones go first, regardless of whether that makes sense. So just something to be aware of when you're thinking about how to sort stuff. So now I see that the earliest film I have in the data set was made in 1970. And I have some films from 1971 and things like that. And yeah, now it's sorted. I'll pause again for a second if anyone has any questions. And we're going to move on to the next part of the workshop, which is looking at charts. So creating a couple of visualizations of some data, and we'll move on to using the other sheets. So this is sort of covering some basic manipulation and calculation with data. And then some of the other things that we can do is create nice charts with data as well. And in about 15 minutes, we'll take a 3-minute break. So we're going to go to sheet 2. So at the bottom of the spreadsheet, you'll see there's sheet 1, sheet 2, sheet 3, sheet 4. We are now in sheet 2. I'm in sheet 2. So this is sort of like if you're in a browser and you have multiple tabs open. It's the same concept with spreadsheet applications. Each sheet is a spreadsheet. Altogether, this is a workbook. So Excel is calling the whole thing a workbook. And each sheet is its own spreadsheet. So you can have many tables within a workbook, essentially. And the nice thing with Excel, which is something we'll see at the intermediate workshop, is that you can reference across sheets in a single workbook and across workbooks, but it's easier to see within a single workbook. So next week, we'll do a formula that requires referencing across 2 sheets. So just something to be aware of. So right here, we have a table of average international gross in millions of US dollars. We have the year, so it's like an average for each year. For whether they failed or passed the Bechdel test. So we have basically the average for each year, depending on the Bechdel test result. So we can see how much money they made internationally. The idea here is that this replicates a question that someone I think asked in the original post that used this data, which was, does the gross of a film matter based on whether it passed or failed the Bechdel test? Like, do films that fail the Bechdel test make more money than films that are more female friendly and have female characters and female dialogue and, or, you know, whatever we want to call that based on the Bechdel test criteria? So that was the question that they were trying to answer. This table was originally created with a pivot table. So I'll show you how to do this in the intermediate workshop. But essentially it's using functions. It's saying for every year, I'm going to take an average of all the international gross by the criteria of it failing. And you can do that with a function, but it's a bit complicated, and you can do it with pivot tables in 3 seconds. So that's going to be something that we see in the next workshop of why that's useful to use pivot tables. So we're going to go ahead and start a chart with data on it to begin with. So we're going to go ahead and click on cell A2 and then select over to B2. So if you click on a cell and you see your cursor turns into this like big white cross, it's the selection cursor. So if you click down and hold down with your mouse, and select across and select down, that allows you to make a selection. If we select down over to B2 and then we want to select all the way down, there's not that many, so I'm just going to do it manually this time to show you the selection cursor. So I'm selecting down through row 43, and I'm going to have year and all the data for the failed data series. A data series is a series of numbers that comprise one data sort of like one container of data. So Excel uses the term data series to refer to like one column that contains a selection of data, something to be aware of when you're building charts and tables and things like that. And then we're going to go to insert up at the top. So the insert menu in the middle has a section called charts, and it has a series of icons here. So if let's say we're looking at, so fundamentally what we're looking at here are two things that vary across time. So we're interested in looking at these things over time, with year being our time variable that we're going to plot this on. Does anyone have, you could put this in the chat, does anyone have an idea of like, how do you visually represent this information? What would be the best chart? So we have some bar charts, we have column charts, line charts, pie charts, other kinds of charts, scatter plots. Which one would be the way to represent something over time? If anyone, and Sandy, I'll let you read it out if anyone puts anything in the chat. I'll give you 20 seconds. What kind of chart would make sense? So you're looking at trends over time. It's a quiet group. Someone want to guess so I know people are listening at least? No? Hopefully my internet didn't cut out and I'm not talking to... A line graph. Someone says a line graph. Thank you. That is what I was looking for because that is the most intuitive answer, a line graph. Yes. So you would represent these as lines. And Excel has a line graph option, but you should not use a line graph for a line graph. Here's a really not intuitive thing in Excel, is that actually line charts in Excel treat the data as text. And when you're looking at something over time, time is usually a numerical value, right? So year is numerical, even a date is considered a numerical value. You can put it on a scale that has a range, and each difference, like 1972 to 1973 to 1974, each year is meaningful. They're 1 year apart from each other, and that's the same distance. You can measure it along a scale in equal intervals, essentially, right? And those intervals have a numerical meaning, right? They each contain a certain number of days and all of that. So it makes sense that we would put it on a numerical scale to look at it. A line chart does not do that. And therefore you cannot manipulate the line chart's information chronologically. So if you have numbers or dates on the horizontal axis of a line chart, you can't edit that based on chronology because it doesn't understand that those are numbers. So that's really a pain and strange, a really strange thing in Excel is that, and very super non-intuitive, is that for a line chart, you want to create a scatter plot. You would click the little icon that has little darts, and then you would select the scatter with straight lines. So that is actually the way to create a line chart in Excel if you have numerical values on the horizontal axis. So if you have two sets of numerical values, like the average international gross in millions of US dollars is a numerical value, and the year is also a numerical value, and that it's a meaningful number, like they're real numbers, then you want a line chart, but you don't want to use the line chart. You want to use the scatter with straight lines. Extremely not intuitive. So I went ahead and clicked that, and don't worry about what it looks like right now. I'm just going to collapse my formula bar. Oops. A bit of a lag. All right, so I went ahead and clicked scatter with straight lines. So now you'll see it does look like a line chart, right? So that's how you create line charts, super annoying. Excel likes to add white space around the data because it thinks it looks nice, but that's kind of misleading because it's showing that the original point is 1960 and that the data should go to 2020, whereas this data ends in 2013, and the first year that we have is 1972. So we shouldn't have anything on the chart that's misleading, and that includes phantom numbers, like, you know, points for data where we don't have anything like that in our data set. We'll fix that after we add the Bechdel pass values. So whenever you're editing a chart, the main way to edit a chart is to click on the select data button. So once you create a chart, you should be in the chart design menu up at the top. It should be automatic. If you're not, you will still, if you click on the chart somewhere, you should see the chart design menu. Anytime you add something in Excel, and this is also the same in Word and across other Microsoft products, but you should see a menu to be able to edit that element if you're clicked on it. So you should see chart design at the top, and you should see somewhere a button called select data. In most newer versions of Excel, that's to the right of this menu. In older versions of Mac, it is on the complete opposite side, it is on the left side. I don't know why, and it might be called something slightly different, but essentially it's something that means select data. And that's how you edit what's on the chart in terms of the actual data that's on the chart. So I'm going to go ahead and click select data, and then you'll have a dialog box come up. And again, it doesn't matter what the chart looks like now, we can totally ignore it for the time being. And you'll see that it says chart data range equals sheet 2 exclamation point $A $2 colon $B $43. So basically what it's saying is it's using a function to lock the chart to a table range. It's saying sheet 2, and that's what the name of the sheet is. If you put an exclamation point, it means anything before the exclamation point is the name of the sheet, and that's a verbatim, it's case sensitive. Anything to the right of that is the function. And it's basically saying that the selection is going to be locked to A2, and then the colon again means through B43. So now you know what those dollar signs mean. It means it's using absolute reference to lock the chart reference. And Sandy, I saw you have to go, that's fine. If anyone has anything in the comment, I'm happy to go ahead and check. We'll take a short break soon. It won't go 2 hours though, if anyone's worried about that. So you'll see that in our legend entry series, we have fail here. So that's the first data series that we have. And on the horizontal axis labels, we have those years. So it sort of gives you a preview of the years. And we, sorry, just gotta fix something with my video. Oh my gosh, okay. So we want to add the past data as well. The other thing to note here is that before we do that, I wanted to let you know that you have to know in Excel for a scatter plot that X is the horizontal axis. So the X axis means the horizontal. Right now on the chart, the year is plotted on the horizontal axis. It's called an axis, that bottom part of the chart. So the X is horizontal and Y is vertical. So the dollars for the average international gross is plotted on the vertical. And so scatter plots deal with 2 numerical variables. So the dollar amount is numerical and the year is numerical. And so that's why scatter plot is the most appropriate here. You have to know, and again, you have to know that X means horizontal and Y means vertical. So we're going to click Add under Legend Entry Series. And then I'm going to get, and don't worry about what the chart looks like, it's going to be fine. And then I get this box that says Edit Series, and it says, what's the series name? So what we can actually do is type pass. I'm going to do it. You don't have to, though. So you can type that, and that can tell it that it's the series called pass, or I can click on the cell that contains the name pass. So C2 contains the word pass. So if I just click there, once I'm clicked into that series names box, you'll see that it is locking it to that cell reference with the dollar signs. And then if I click into series X values, then you'll see again on the right-hand side, it gives you a little preview. So it says equals pass. So it recognizes that the cell I clicked on has the word pass in it. So X values, again, we have to know that that's the horizontal, and we're going to plot the same thing on the horizontal. So for when you add data to a chart, if you have multiple series, multiple columns you're adding, you're still plotting both of those over the same horizontal or X-axis, right? We're still looking at them both over the same number of years. So X is going to be years again, because we're going to put the past values on top of years again, look at them over years. So I'm going to click on A3, and I'm going to do Control Shift down, and that's going to get me equals sheet 2, A3 through A43. And then I can go ahead and click into series Y values. Let me see. If someone asked if I change the name of the cell, it will change it automatically in the chart. Yes. So that's pretty fun, huh? So all those things are linked to, when you have something linked to a cell reference, whatever is in the cell gets put on the chart if it's live. Yeah, it's cool. So for series Y values, we want to delete the equals 1 in curly brackets. This comes up a lot. Why is it there? Nobody knows. If you try to put values on top of that, you'll get this way out of proportion error message that doesn't tell you how to fix it and just looks really, really dramatic. But you just need to delete whatever's in the series Y values. It is super annoying. And you, like, first, I don't know how anyone would know that unless someone told you that. But that's just something you always have to do if you see it there. Just delete that. And then we're good to go to put the values in. So we can go ahead and click on C3. So our values start on the first observation for the past category. So that's the first number. C3, and then we'll do Control or Command Shift down to get through 43, and you'll see these dollar signs in the colon, and hopefully that will make sense that it's saying C3 through C43, and we're locking it to that specific reference. So you can sort of see in the preview, we have past, we have 1972, 73, that sounds good. Series Y values, I don't know why it's giving me a weird preview. We'll hope that works out. We're gonna click OK. Oh, it's fine. It just didn't update. So now I'll sort of see on the chart that it looks more like how it's supposed to look. And I'll go ahead and click OK. So I have both my series fail and my series pass, and I can see they're both plotted on year. And normally I ask a couple questions of like, how do I know which one goes on the horizontal and which one goes on the Y? In this case, so generally the rule of thumb is when you're looking at two pieces of information. So here we have time, year, and we have average international gross in millions of dollars. And we're plotting average international gross over the year. But why don't we plot it the other way around? So the idea is that whatever is the independent variable, which I'll explain, the independent variable always goes on the horizontal axis or the x-axis. So you're saying that's the thing that's causing the other thing, or the other thing changes as a consequence of what's on the horizontal axis. It's the other one is the dependent variable. The dependent variable goes on the y or the vertical axis. So what does that mean? It means one, you're trying to show that one is likely precursor or predating the other one. Like one either you don't, it's not as strong as causing necessarily, but you're just saying one of those things clearly would happen anyway. Like years would go by regardless of whether films made money, right? But films, you know, can't make money over time unless time actually passes. So you're sort of trying to make an argument that one is a consequence of the other. And sometimes that can be very tricky to figure out. So if someone's looking at, you know, what's the impact on someone graduating in terms of a number of factors, right? So we might not know which factor actually causes, which one comes first and which one is the main cause or something like that. But with time, it's very straightforward. Time is always independent. It is always on the horizontal axis, always on the X. And normally when I do this workshop for the general public, there's someone from physics who always goes, is it always independent? And then I'm like, yes, stop. So luckily we didn't get any of that today, because then you get sucked into these like drama conversations about the theory of relativity, and I'm not doing that. But for every other purpose, if we're not theoretical physicists, time is independent, right? So now we have two really nice lines where we can see our data. We probably want to know what's the red line and what's the blue line, and we might want to even change the color so that if someone has color vision deficiency, that they And if they don't see that there's red and blue here, that they would want to be able to see that there's distinct lines. So there's a short way to add elements to the chart. We'll finish up this chart and then we'll take a, well, we'll see how we're feeling because there's only maybe 10 minutes worth left of the workshop. So after this, I'll just take a straw poll in the chat and see how we're doing. But essentially, we can go ahead and click this green cross on the top right-hand corner of the chart. If you don't see it there, then there's also a menu under chart design. There's a button to the left called Add Chart Element, and you'll have all of these options there as well under the Add Chart Element. So if you later go back, if you don't have this green plus sign, but if you're working with the version of Excel that comes with McGill computers in the last few years, you should see the plus sign here where we can check off axis titles. So we want to put a label on each axis. We want to say that one is the year and one is international gross in millions of dollars. We want a title for our chart. And we might want a legend. Some folks say that, that we should just write fail and pass directly near the lines somewhere on the chart. A legend is also fine if you just want to make a quick chart and it, you know, most folks can understand that that's what it is. So we've added a legend that'll tell you which line belongs to which series. And I can go ahead and click this green, the plus sign again, and now we'll want to just update this information. And I'll show you a couple tricks. The other thing is first what we want to do is remove this 10-year period before and after the data that doesn't exist in the data set itself. So someone asked a question, but I'm going to actually answer you at the end of the workshop. So I'll come back to that question. So the way we would edit the axis, like the numbers chronologically, if we wanted to show just the data that we collected just from 1972 to, I believe, 2013, you can right click on a number in the axis. So I'm going to put my cursor directly over the number 1970 and I'm going to right click. It's going to take a second, I guess. Oh my gosh. Okay, there. And then you should see a menu pop up that says Format Axis at the bottom. So if you right click on any element in the chart, oh my gosh, sorry, there's a bit of a lag on, oh my goodness, I have a lag and now I'm clicking too much. Okay, if you right click on any element in the chart, you'll see this dialog box come out and it'll say format, whatever that is. And then you'll be able to bring up a menu to allow you to format that item. So again, I'm going to click on right click on 1970. I'm going to click Format Axis. And then I'm going to see a dialog box come up on the right side that says Format Axis. And now once I have that menu on the right side, if I click somewhere else, don't do this, just stay on Format Axis. But if I click on data, the red line, or if I click on the other axis or the chart itself, you'll see that that menu updates. So you could be editing those elements. So you can just click around and edit whatever you want at that point. But if I'm in the Format Axis menu, you'll want to be in the Axis Options menu, and you'll see the minimum bounds is 1960 and the max is 2020. If you had used a line chart in Excel, so not the scatter plot with straight lines, but a line chart, you would not be able to edit this item here because it would not understand that 1960 is a number. And so that's the difference between a line chart and a scatter plot. It's very strange that it lets you plot things on a line chart that you then can't edit. But let's say we wanted the minimum to be 1972 because we know that's the number, the year that we have in our data set. So I can go ahead and just delete what's there, 1960, type 1972. And then for maximum, I can delete whatever it puts there and put 20, let's do 13, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, so 2013. So now we have the data taking up the chart area. So that's a much more representative visualization of this data, right? It's not stretching it, it's not squishing it. So when you squish the data with that white space, it makes the peaks look higher. So it's sort of a way to manipulate people into thinking that something is more dramatic than it actually is. And so that's why it's really important, even in Excel, when creating charts, to make sure that the chart has the data exactly the way that it's actually stored. And for units, we have the major unit is 10. Let's say we wanted it every 5 years instead of every 10 years. So that would be for the x-axis, what's the major unit? We could put 5 and hit enter. And that looks a bit nicer, at least then I can sort of make a bit more of a distinct argument about something changing over time. To change the axis title, you could click on the word axis title and you'll see that it's selected. So what I think a lot of people do is they end up clicking into the text box, highlighting the text, deleting it, and then typing. If you just click to highlight the text box, so it's highlighted, but I haven't clicked into the text box itself, and I go ahead and type year, you will see that it appears up in the formula bar of my workbook. So the word year is there. Nothing is happening. Axis title still is in that box. Year is up in the formula bar. If I hit enter, then it will update the text box. I'll do that again. I'll click axis title for the vertical axis or the y-axis. I will just start typing average international gross in millions of US dollars. It's always nice to have the unit, make sure that people know it's US dollars, make sure that people know it's in millions. And I can go ahead and hit enter. And that is going to update the y-axis. I could do the same for chart title, but I'll let you all try to do that on your own to see how you can try to name the chart. Basically, when you name charts, you want to have the two things, the two variables, and their relationship defined. So we can say the average international gross in average international gross of films that failed or passed the Bechdel test over time, or something like that, right? Or between 1972 and 2013. So something very precise so people know exactly what they're looking at, right? The last thing I'm going to show you is how to change the color of the line. So if I go ahead and click on the blue line, let's say, you should see that whole line sort of highlighted. You'll see format data series on the right-hand side in that menu. If you see format data point, it means it's just selected one point on the line, and you basically want to try to click off the chart somewhere and click back onto the line and hope that it understands that you want a line and not the point itself. We'll click the little paint can icon, and then we will go ahead and change the color. So here I'm on the red one. So when I click color, I can see red. I'm going to go ahead and change it to black. I think something nice to do is to change colors to grayscale, and that way they're more accessible across devices or across different kinds of ways that people see colors or don't see colors. So I'm going to click on the blue line, and I'm going to change that to sort of lighter gray. So I'll have black and gray. You can also use patterns for one and not the other to distinguish. You just want to make sure that everyone would be able to see this no matter what format. And if you need to print it, perhaps having grayscale makes more sense because it's not clear how it's going to print. And that would be the chart. Last thing we're going to do with this chart is we're going to right click in the white space of the chart. So not on a chart element, but somewhere in the white space of the chart itself. And then you should get this really big menu. And in the middle, you'll see Move Chart. So I don't know if anyone has this experience where they make a chart in Excel and then they copy and paste it into Word and the formatting completely changes. That's because if you edit the chart within the table, the sheet where the data are located, none of the formatting is locked. So when you put it in Word, Word is just going to decide based on something, I don't know what, based on magic, like how it should be formatted. If you want to format a chart and then have it be locked so that when you copy paste it into Word or into a website or into another environment, that the formatting doesn't actually change at all, you have to move it to its own sheet and do the editing of the formatting there. So again, I right-clicked into the white part of the chart. I'm going to click Move Chart. And now I'm going to make sure I select New Sheet in the dialog box that comes up. And I'm going to call this whatever, average gross Bechdel year or something. I don't know, something descriptive so that if I make multiple charts, I know which one this one is. I would just name it something. You can go ahead, make sure it's a new sheet, and then click OK. La, 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 la. And now it's going to move to its own sheet. And now you'll see that the font is actually quite small. And that's how it would have copied into Word. And it's not something I was aware of because Excel was sort of magnifying it for me in the other sheet, basically, so that I could work with it. But this is the actual formatting of the chart. So if I want to change the font size, I could click on, one of the axes, and I could go to Home, and I could make sure that it's like a size 12 point font or something like that. So if I adjust it here and then I copy this and paste it into Word, it should preserve whatever formatting you're doing. So that's one other trick. We have one more thing to do that should take about 5 to 6 minutes. Do we want to take a break or do we want to just do the last thing? You can say in the chat if you have a super strong opinion about it. If not, okay, let's see. Let's finish up. I got that vibe. So let's see. Okay, 2, that's it. We're gonna finish up. So we're gonna go ahead and click on sheet 3. So I should say this is the last thing we're gonna do, and then I have one extra thing to show you that I'm gonna do off the recording. So we can take a break at that point if people want to. But if we're on sheet 3, you'll see a table that says number of films. So we have Bechdel test, high, medium, Bechdel test in column A, so by films that failed or passed. Then we have the number of films in each budget category. So high budget, medium budget, low budget. And here the idea is, the question was, do films that fail the Bechdel test, did they have a higher budget than films that pass? So do people invest more in films that are like less female friendly is the idea. So just looking at sheer numbers. So that was the question. And going back to sheet 2 actually, or going back to our chart, just really quickly, I normally ask people like, does this chart make sense? Or like, what is this telling you? But since it's Monday afternoon, I'm just gonna tell you. So I usually ask, what is this chart telling you? And I think generally people say like it more or less looks like films that fail or pass the Bechdel test tend to make more or less the same amount internationally, right? Like that there's not a major clear pattern one way or the other, that films that pass seem to do overall as much as well as films that fail without having any numbers or summary like that, just by eyeballing the data. So I say that seems fine, but does anything seem weird about this data to anyone? So sometimes people say, yeah, it's weird that it looks like films made a lot more money between 1972 and 87 than they do now. And based on what we know about the world, that doesn't make so much sense because some of the highest grossing films were made in the last 20 years, right? So why would that be the case? I'll let people have 2 seconds to guess and then I'll just tell you since it's Monday. And this is a sort of like beware of data visualization and danger of like working with data. Like we still have to think about what makes sense. So I don't see any volunteers trying to guess, so I'll tell you, it is because this is an average. And for 1972, we only have a few films. If we're doing more, yes, the person who said if we're doing more films, it's because more films were made. Exactly. So what's going on here is that we have only a few films in our data set before 1992, or we have far fewer. And those films happen to be the ones that made the most that year, right? So there were a ton of films made in 1972 to 1992. We just don't have them all in the data set. If we had them all, this would look a lot flatter, or it would look trending upward towards more recent years. But we have a lot more films in the more recent years, and at least half of those films did not make a lot of money, and half made an extraordinary amount of money. But when you take the average, it looks pretty flat, right? So this is just a beware of things you're comparing kind of cautionary tale. So this chart doesn't actually make sense. What we would have to do is either find all the films from those earlier years so that it was more evenly, comparable, or we would have to just look at the years where we had all the data, because otherwise the average won't make sense. So just something to point out, but the visualization itself, we also have to think about it a minute and make sure that it makes sense. And then this table, again, I'd like to just point out that I also made this one with pivot tables, and we're also going to look at how to do that on Wednesday. So I made this in 2 seconds using pivot tables. So another example of why it's really useful to be able to do that. Okay, so now we're going to create the chart without pre-populating the chart with a line. So I'm going to click into column I. You have to click sort of away from the table, because basically Excel tries to guess what you want. And if you're clicked close to the table, it goes, aha, you want to put this table in a chart. But we're going to try to start from a blank chart just to see how it looks, and so that you can be familiar with building a chart without relying on pre-populating the chart with data. So I'm clicked on I or even J. I'm going to go to Insert. This time I'm going to use a column chart because I have categorical data. So on the one hand, I'm going to show the number of films. That's a numerical value, the number of films. But on the horizontal axis, I'm going to use budget category. I'm going to arrange it from low, medium to high budget. But that's not a numerical value. Like low, medium, and high, they are called categorical variables or data because they can be arranged in an order. They're categories. They represent categories that can be arranged in an order, right? So there's some meaning to put low first and high last, like we know that, but Excel doesn't know what that is, or what order it should be in. So that's like text data that we're putting on the axis there. So we want to use either column chart or a type of chart that allows you to put text data. So if we add the chart without clicking on the table first, it's just going to be blank. And then again, we want to just make sure we drag and drop our chart away from the table so that we will be able to select the information. We'll again click the Select Data button. Again, that's the way that we build information on the chart. We'll click Add. For the series name, the first one will be Fail. And then we will again delete that =1 in curly brackets, which you always have to delete, which I don't know why. And this time, instead of selecting down, we will select across from cell B3 to cell D3. So across all the budget categories for the fail series. And we will click OK. So you'll see 3 columns emerge. I'm going to go a little bit faster with this one, and then we'll click Add again for, oh my gosh, sorry, my computer is quite slow. We'll click Add again, we'll click Pass or type Pass. We'll delete the =1 in curly brackets. We will select from B4 to D4 across for the pass, and then we should see a second column appear. And then we were going to have to tell it what to label for the horizontal labels, because that horizontal axis in this case is considered text. So 1, 2, 3 there are just really arbitrary placeholders because it doesn't know what to put there. It doesn't know how to order them or what the point is. So we're going to go ahead and click Edit and select from B2 to D2, high budget, medium budget, low budget. So those are the labels. And click OK. And then click OK again. And voila, we have a lovely chart that has categories on the horizontal axis instead of numbers. We can go ahead and click that green plus sign and add titles to the axes, a chart title and a legend. And now we can see that overall, it's true that films that failed the Bechdel test tend to seem to get a higher budget, more than a factor of 2 times. But we also saw that on average, films that passed the Bechdel test didn't do worse than films that failed, meaning that they're doing more or less the same, but are not having the same budget to begin with, right? They're having a lower or a medium budget. So interesting. And you can play around with this again and change the colors. So if I clicked on the red bar, then I could format the data series. Oh, one thing to note, this is the trick. If you create a bar chart or a column chart and you click on the bar to edit the color, for some reason, the menu that is like not collapsed is the border. So you'll see here under the paint can that border is expanded, but actually we want to change the fill color of the bar. So just be careful here that for some reason it thinks you want to just change the outline of each bar, the color of the outline, which is white, which doesn't matter. But actually I want to change the interior of the bar, so from blue to, let's say, grayscale. So that's a bit annoying. You just have to make sure that when you click across, that it realizes that you don't want to do the border. Or if you don't notice, then that's what happened if nothing changes. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording so that I can show the last thing, or we can ask questions.